Welcome to the Golf Improvement Podcast, episode 40.
Welcome to the podcast for golf lovers and enthusiasts who are looking to take their games to new heights. Dedicated to custom club fitting, short game improvement, and effective practice to improve your golf game. This is the Golf Improvement Podcast with your host, Tony Wright.
Hello, this is Tony Wright from Game Improvement Golf in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, with the Golf Improvement Podcast, dedicated to bringing you useful information on custom club fitting, short game improvement, and effective practice techniques to take your game to new heights. Well, tomorrow I'm off to attend the 10th Annual Association of Golf Club Fitting Professionals Roundtable that's held each year in Columbus, Georgia. I believe this is the 8th of these that I've attended. It's going to be another overdose week of learning. I'm excited in particular about a couple presentations that I'll at least point out. Keith Chatham is going to talk on how to effectively fit for face angle when you're doing driver fittings. And Tom Wishon from Tom Wishon Golf will be there. He'll give the keynote presentation. He's going to give an overview of his knowledge and learning on club performance in terms of his 42 years in the golf industry. And probably as much fun as the presentations are all the connecting and evening discussions we have. We sit for an hour or two every night and just talk about questions that we have with each other. And so it should be another great week of learning. And I'm looking forward to bringing some of that information back to you in my next podcast. Well, with that said, I know you're really going to enjoy this interview with Noah Kageyama, the bulletproof musician, and he's going to talk about performance improvement and, in my words, performing under the gun. Hello, this is Tony Wright with the Golf Improvement Podcast. My guest today is Dr. Noah Kageyama, who is a sport and performance psychologist who's on the faculty at the Juilliard, I guess you say the Juilliard School of Music, or most people just know what the Juilliard School is, I guess, Noah, right?
Yeah, they just call it Juilliard, but officially it does. It has the in front of it, just like Ohio State, the Ohio State University.
There you go.
Yeah.
He has a terrific website called the Bulletproof Musician. Now, what are golfers talking about the Bulletproof Musician? Well, you'll know after we've talked today. But he blogs about many elements of improving practice and performance, so that's where we're coming from today. So, Noah, thank you for doing this and welcome.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. Many of the people's stories that I talk to sort of start out with, well, I didn't know how to do this, and then so I learned. And I think there's some elements of that to yours. So why don't you talk about your story about how you got into understanding how to practice better and perform better?
Well, I started off as a little Suzuki student when I was 2.5 years old, and just kind of continued along the path of training to be a musician. And from a young age, did a lot of performing, did a lot of master classes and summer festivals and competitions and, big and small performances all over the place. And so I realized from a fairly young age that performance was a whole different experience than just playing in a lesson or playing in the practice room. Because the biggest thing that I noticed is, one, you feel very different, right, in a performance. I mean,
yeah,
I didn't have words to describe what it was, but it was definitely anxiety and nerves and jitters, and hands would get cold and my heart would be pounding, and my thoughts would be all scattered. And then partly because of that, things sometimes go to crap in a performance, and it doesn't matter how prepared you are, just unexpectedly things just aren't going your way. And I never really understood that inconsistency, right? Because sometimes you could be really well prepared and think you totally have it down and not even be that nervous, and then it falls flat. And other times you might be, borderline freaking out and not particularly well prepared, but somehow things magically go well. And so that was just a constant source of confusion and frustration to me. And I read lots of things as a kid. I grew up reading things like The Inner Game of Tennis and found Tony Robbins' books to be interesting. So I kind of read that sort of thing, I think, more than most kids my age might have engaged in back in those days. But I never could quite figure out the answer. So I just kept wondering and looking and reading. And finally I got to grad school at Juilliard. I went there to study music, but ended up discovering sports psychology because I'd never heard of it to that point. This is, back before Google and the internet was really what it is today. And so I never even thought to search for things about performance under pressure. And so once, I took this class with a fellow named Don Green, who some of your listeners might even be familiar with. He was a sports psychologist for the Olympic diving team back in the 80s when Greg Louganis was diving and competing, and has gone on to work with a number of tennis players and Formula One racers, and actually very high level golfers. Some of whom have been household names amongst the the golfing community.
Yeah,
and so he was teaching a class for musicians and starting to do more work with musicians. And at first, I think everyone was a little bit skeptical. It's like, what does this military guy know about becoming a better artist and performing and practicing more effectively? And but it turns out that performance is performance, whatever the domain for the most part. And all the things that he had to share with us from his experience working with high-level athletes totally resonated and related. And so we just soaked it up, and me in particular, because this is all the stuff that I was looking for my whole life and I'd never found. And I couldn't believe that it was here in this domain of psychology that no one had ever told me about. So that's where my interests started to really align. And I discovered that it wasn't, music does hold an important and a special place in my heart, obviously, and it means a lot to me, like the creative element and the art of it and all that. But, reflecting, what I think I always really was intrigued by most is just getting better at things. Whether it was music or tennis or, Mario Kart on the Nintendo, like I just want to get better at things, and that I didn't really know how to get better at things, and then to demonstrate that ability under pressure, obviously is frustrating to anybody, but really kind of drove me to find eventually the sports psychology. And so once I found that this field of study existed, I just wanted to learn more. And I was talking to Don one day, and he sort of facetiously said, why, if you want to learn more, just go back to school and get your PhD in psychology. And then you'll know, whatever you want to. And he didn't say it in quite that way, but I don't know if he was thinking that I would seriously do that. And I ended up, once I finished up at Juilliard, I looked around at some schools and ended up going to Indiana to do my PhD in psychology. So yeah, it really fits your theme. Like there wasn't, anything other mysterious other than I didn't know how to do something and I wanted to learn more, and I started looking.
And it was kind of the fit you were probably looking for all along and just didn't know it in a way. It really does sound a lot like that way. Yeah.
And I wouldn't have known it had I not been at that level. So it all just ends up, fitting. Like I wouldn't have become the sports psychologist that I was, because I wouldn't have had the questions burning quite so deeply had I not been involved in music to that degree. So yeah, it's funny how things work out.
Oh, that's neat. Well, one of the things that I really like about your site is sort of the way you write the articles, because almost every time it's something where you're talking about an area, but then you really back it up with some research that's been done, or some specific study, which is I think a little unique, to what you do. Talk about how you actually sort of go about the process of finding the things that you talk about there.
Well, I look at all over the place because there's so much out there nowadays that it's sort of fun just to see what's out there. There's an app on my phone that I'm a little bit obsessed with, and it's just part of my daily routine. It's called Zite, Z-I-T-E. And it aggregates news and information in a whole range of categories from all over the internet. And I think it'll even take in your RSS feeds and kind of look for other things based on that. And so I have, a psychology section. I have an app section, like new map or new iOS apps or Mac apps that are coming out. I have, business section. I have just news in general. And so, I mean, you can select from any number of categories. And psychology is a rich enough category that there's lots of stuff that pops up that's interesting from time to time. And so that's one source. I may even look at things like Twitter. A lot of journals nowadays have Twitter feeds, and other people, other sports psychologists are talking about their work and things like that. And so there's lots of stuff out there on the regular part of the internet that people can have access to and look and discover. But ultimately, I think what ends up happening is, I do look at a lot of the journals that are in the area of sport and performance psychology and psychology in general. And when I find an interesting article, you look at the reference section, you read through it, and my favorite part of the article is always the literature review that they do at the very beginning, where they do kind of an overview of all the other stuff that came before. And there's always so much cool stuff. It's sort of like the old school version of kind of, going down the rabbit hole that YouTube and Google now has become. But, you kind of follow the paper trail of all these journal articles that are referenced that sound intriguing. And you look at those and you look those up, and those lead to more things. And it just is like this spider web of information that's out there. And then you start dipping over into other somewhat tangential areas, and then that opens up a whole nother network of things to look at. And so it's kind of a fun exploration process that leads to a number of different topics and studies coming together.
Well, since obviously you are doing the things that you said and looking at all this literature, there's a lot of people talking about, how to practice and what's effective practice and things like that, from all kinds of standpoints, from sports, from golf, from music. Mm-hmm. From your perspective, what are the most important misconceptions that people have about, effective practice, and how should they change their misconceptions?
So when I describe this may not sound particularly mind-blowing, but for me, it was. And I'll try to kind of recapture how it occurred to me initially. But, so the way that I grew up practicing was I just play something until something didn't sound good or something didn't work, and then I just rewind a little bit and do it again. And do it again and do it again until it sounded better. And usually it does eventually start to sound better, right? Even if it's an athletic event, you start off and your first free throw is off the mark, but then you keep at it, and you start to get better and better with time, with more repetitions. And what that is what you're observing there are actually called performance effects. So the more time you do something, it's kind of like each repetition after the first one is an even finer level of adjustment relative to what came before. Yeah. So you can kind of eventually start finding the mark more consistently. But then the problem is you hop back on the course the next day, or the driving range, or in the practice room, or step behind the free throw line on test court. Somehow, I think we've all experienced this. Mysteriously, most of all the performance we were exhibiting the day before seems to have disappeared. And we're kind of not necessarily back at square one exactly, but much closer to square one than where we left things the previous day. So, that little tiny bit of progress that's remaining 24 hours later, or 7 days later, or a month later, that's the learning effect. Yeah. And so I just sort of accepted that as that's the way how learning works, right? You just do stuff and you play it over and over and over until it sounds better, and most of it's gone the next day, but maybe a tiny bit will be there. And you just repeat day after day after day after day. Well, as it turns out, there are ways of practicing that totally flip that around, where you can actually maximize learning effects, but it comes at the expense of performance effects. So what ends up happening is you don't sound so much better that day, or you don't feel like you're hitting the ball all much better that day, but the gains that you do make tend to stick around longer. So the next day when you walk back up, on the court or on the course, like more of what you did yesterday is there than the other way of practicing. And a lot of it has to do with, and you've probably come across this, but blocked practice versus random practice. Yeah. Blocked practice is where you do the same shot or the same stroke over and over and over and over. And then, once you feel like that's going better, then you move on to a different shot or a different piece, or, different, backhand instead of forehand. And you work on that until that gets better. But then, the next day you go back and it's much the same. So random practice is sort of a misnomer because it's not actually necessary that these strokes or shots be practiced in random order. They just have to be separated, and it's sort of like an iterative way of practicing. So you work on one shot or one stroke, and then you work on another one, and then you work on another one for much shorter periods of time. So instead of 15 minutes on, let's say, tennis, for instance, instead of 15 minutes on a forehand, 15 on backhands, and 15 on volleys, you say do 5 on forehands, 5 on backhands, 5 on volleys. But then you don't just leave it there. You actually have to come back to the forehand again to try to retrieve those motor skills that you needed in order to perform at the highest level possible. Okay. So then when you come back to that second time, what you're doing is you're practicing retrieval of skills. And that's what we need to be able to do, right? We need to be able to retrieve the exact motor programs that are necessary to execute the very first time. And if we do 15 minutes, we're not actually practicing retrieval very often. We're just practicing sort of progressive improvement and adjustment. You only get to practice retrieval the first couple times you do that skill. So another 5 for forehands, 5 for backhands, 5 for volleys, and then a third time maybe you come back for forehands, backhands, and volleys. And so that it adds up to the same 45-minute amount of practice time, but instead of doing 15-minute blocks, you've done 3 5-minute blocks per skill. And the repetition of trying to retrieve those motor skills is not easy and can lead to some frustration because it doesn't feel like you're getting into a groove. But that is what actually leads to long-term learning and retention. Just like when you're studying for a test, rereading a chapter over and over doesn't particularly help with retrieval, but taking a bunch of practice tests, that actually helps with retrieval, is more likely to result in long-term learning.
Yeah, I try to remember. Oh, and I was going to feel embarrassed that I didn't remember the name. I think that came up, isn't it? Mark McDaniel, probably the name. He talked a lot in one. It's another book that I read.
That's right.
His book, and he actually did a podcast with me. That's why maybe my brain was allowed to bring it back. But he talked so much in there about the importance of testing and maybe not getting so hung up about the fact that you're taking a lot of tests because it's what's really going to get you there, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, the book that he wrote with, Roediger and Brown, I think is a must read for anyone who's alive, at any age. But I mean, especially if it has to do with learning a skill or, and we have to learn all the time, right? Whether we're golfers or musicians or, insurance agents, like we're always having to learn. And the more effectively we can learn in less time, the more time we have to spend on things like golf. So, I think it's a must read.
Yeah, it's really a neat book. Well, another thing that you talk a lot about on your site, and let me back up. I haven't heard, a discussion about, this sort of approach and how you sort of stack stuff up before. I thought that was really interesting.
And I should say too, before we move on, that deliberate practice is sort of the element of practice that gets overlooked when everyone's talking about 10,000 hours or 10 years in order to become an expert. The more important element of Anders Ericsson's research is this notion that not all practice is created equal. So the random versus blocked is certainly one part of it, but deliberate practice is something that Daniel Coyle talks a lot about in the Talent Code, and it's essentially problem-solving practice. And we don't like to do that because that's not particularly fun. We like to do things that come easily and that we're doing better because we don't want to go out on the course or on the driving range and look like we suck. That's not fun. I mean, it's not good for our ego, and it's just not good for, our standing in the community of golf that we play in. But and I actually wrote about this recently. There was a study they did with like Gaelic footballers, which is like a cross combination. It's like a mashup of basketball, soccer, and rugby, it looks like. But, they had these elite level players and these intermediate level players practice kicking at particular targets on a wall. And the elite level folks, they didn't work on their strongest kick. they worked on their weakest kick.
Yeah, I remember that right up. Yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
and that's not fun because it means they're doing something that's a struggle, but they improved that. The intermediate folks worked and spent more time on their stronger kick and much less on their weaker kick, and so they didn't really improve their weaker kick. Sure, they improved their stronger kick, but there was no gain on their weaker kick, which is going to hold them back ultimately. And interestingly, there were 3 intermediate level footballers who did practice more like the elite level folks, and they not only improved their stronger kick, but they also improved their weaker kick, and so they gained much more relative to their cohort than the rest of them. So I mean, it doesn't mean that we have to choose between improving our strongest skills, because there's certainly benefit to that, and our weakest skills. We can do both, and ultimately, random practice and deliberate practice can help us achieve those things in the same amount of time.
Yeah, neat stuff. Well, the other element of your site is not just about practicing, but it's about performing on, what I called sort of under the gun. Talk a little bit about this area too, because it's it's not easy to practice and feel good about it, but then you got to go out and you have a tough shot, or you got some competition, or whether it's like you said in music or in golf or whatever. And what are some of the important elements of being more effective there?
Well, and this is what initially drew me to sports psychology, even before all the learning and the practice stuff came into play, because this is the thing that really bothers high performers the most, right? Like, you're prepared, you can do this, you've done it hundreds or thousands or million times before, and then suddenly, under pressure, it's like you turn into a different person, and you can't retrieve those skills, and you can't perform at the level that you were fully capable of. And there's maybe nothing more frustrating to performer than that. Oh, yeah. And what I discovered is that, and it's so obvious, but I don't know why it never really registered. Elite performers, they certainly do a lot of physical training, and they understand the mechanics and they understand strategy, but they also do an awful lot of mental preparation and mental practice. And I don't even just mean visualization and those kinds of things, but we all have these physical scripts, if you want to call them that, motor programs, motor movements, things that we need to work on physically in order to be able to execute at the highest level. We also need to work, however, on the mental scripts. What exactly should I be thinking about right before I hit this really crucial, important putt? Or what is the most important or helpful thing to think about right before I tee off? Or what should I be thinking about as I'm walking from, where I teed off to the ball? Like, our mind can go to very different places depending on whether there's pressure involved or not. And we need to be able to practice optimal mindset so that when the moment comes, we know exactly what to think about and exactly what to do. There's a great paper that came out of Arizona State University. There's actually, I don't remember exactly what her title is. She's a sports psychologist, and she's a researcher, and she's a professor at Arizona State. But she's also, I think, somehow credentialed or licensed, or I don't know what the term is, but she's involved with PGA or LPGA. So she's also a skilled golfer. Her name is Debbie Cruz. And,
she and I have talked. She's a neat person. Boy,
yeah. And
right.
so, I love that the study that she did on what, the better putters were thinking about right before they putted the ball. And, Don Green and his mentor when he was in grad school, all these sports psychologists have looked at what they call pre-performance routines. Mm-hmm. What is it that athletes should be thinking about and doing right before executing a shot to make sure that mentally, physically, and emotionally they're in the most optimal place. And I've sort of adapted some of this for musicians, but really for athletes too, it doesn't have to be the same thing for everybody, but we do need a clear target. We need to know exactly what we're trying to do, right? Like, where we want the ball to go. It also helps to remember how it feels when that's what happens, a kinesthetic sensation.
Yeah.
Just so we don't get too focused on the minutia of, what my hands, my fingers, and my arms, and my legs, and my feet should all be doing. Because if we start thinking about too many of those things, we disrupt the automaticity of something that we already know how to do. And just making sure we're physically loose and taking some deep breaths to make sure we can quiet our mind and kind of take the edge off the stress response a little bit. All these things come together in the moment, but unless we've practiced them and made that an automatic part of how we approach every shot, it's going to be disruptive in a high pressure situation because it's going to be new and different.
Yeah, so what you're saying, I mean, I think I understand why you're saying it's almost common sense. I mean, we practice all the mechanic stuff, but the part where that can affect our ability to get to the mechanics or to be able to be at ease, we never think about, or very often don't think about, right? Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. That's interesting perspective. It's funny how so many things that people learn end up being things that when you think about it, I said, how come I didn't think about that before, right?
I know, yeah.
It almost doesn't seem fair sometimes to me.
Right.
But that's how it is. Well, you also have on your website an online course called Beyond Practicing. Maybe talk a little bit about the contents of that, but also you obviously you've had some folks who've taken it, and maybe one of your best success stories related to that course. It doesn't have to be about golf either, I mean, because we're talking about performance, but if it's golf, that's good.
Well, I've really made the course specific to musicians. And so when athletes have asked me about it, whether they play tennis or golf, I've actually told them, if you're not doing this for music, there are better places to go to try to find this information. Because I've really, that's sort of what I wanted to do for musicians. I wanted to take sports psychology and find a way for them to have it make sense for them when they read this. And so if you have any folks interested in, I would say, if you're looking at this for golf, I'll make some other recommendations at the end that are going to be more helpful. Yeah. But it's all based off of Don Green's work way back in maybe 20, 25 years ago with athletes. Because what he tried to do is find out if he could identify the key mental factors that were predictive of athletes being successful under pressure. Is it their ability to calm themselves down when they need to, or is it their ability to focus? Is it their ability to bounce back from mistakes? I mean, which of these factors are really connected most directly to high-level performance? And so he did some research, and he tapped into the community of high-level elite athletes that he had access to, and did a factor analysis to figure out that there were somewhere between 6 and 12 highly predictive factors that would lead to peak performance if these skills were highly developed. And so the course is really built around 7 factors that are key for musicians, from energy regulation to resilience to concentration, focus, and confidence, and things like that. And so what I've done is just put together as many exercises and actionable concrete strategies that musicians can use based on what their mental skills profile looks like. So they'll start off by taking this mental skills profile, identify their strengths and weaknesses, and then dive into the specific areas where there's some exercises and some skill development things that they can do to get better and strengthen these areas, and then continue to test themselves in actual performances and auditions to see how things go and how things feel. And by the end of it, hopefully have a very different experience, not just of performing, but also of practicing and what they do in preparation for performances. So yes, I've had folks write to me, being very grateful about winning big auditions, and this is huge for them because this is their livelihood and this is what their life is going to look like. And so, obviously, that's exceedingly meaningful, and it's awesome to see that they're able to do things that they may not have been able to do before, or weren't sure if they're going to be able to do before. And then people have written in about getting off the beta blockers and being able to perform the best and have a different experience of performances, which is also really cool to hear. But one of the stories that really stuck out to me was an attorney who, that's what he does for a living, and he's accomplished in that area, but he also likes to play piano just as a hobby, and he gives one recital every year for friends and family and work associates and stuff like that. But it was always such a frustrating and difficult and scary experience for him. I mean, he continued to do it, hoping that someday it'd feel different, but it was always, extremely stressful, and he didn't feel like he was ever able to really play the way that he knew he could. And so he said, I'm going to give this course a shot and see what I can learn from it. And he told me about doing things like adversity training with his wife. And adversity training is where people have just people distract you while you're trying to play, or just try to get under your skin, or do things that would simulate the kinds of distractions that can happen in a performance, and and other things. So it sounded like he and his wife were kind of having fun preparing for this recital, and but then most importantly, when the day of the recital came, he nailed it. I mean, he had a great performance, and he was just so happy and thankful about how this experience was so different that, he sent me an email and let me know how things had gone. And that was, not more meaningful than musicians taking it, but it was so cool to me that folks who weren't professional musicians but felt very strongly about music and that was important to them were also able to take these skills and benefit from them just as much as, the high-level performers and pros and early career folks were able to as well.
Ah, what a great story. And I'm like you said, I'm sure, like you said, a great feeling. Well, you said you were going to mention a few other things for those people that might want to hear about them, some other ideas about how people can utilize some of the thoughts and ideas that you talk. So I'll let you do that.
Right. So one, I already mentioned, Make It Stick, The Science of Successful Learning by Brown, Werdiger, and McDaniel. And then there's two, and that's, about learning and our skills and our ability to maximize our ability to have the things that we work on stick over time. But then specific to the mental game, because this is, for someone who's already worked really hard at the physical part of golf, but is feeling like the mental part is, holding them back from, those few strokes that they want to cut off, maybe very possibly even more, and just also having a different experience of performing so you can go out there and compete more often or put yourself in pressure situations or, play with folks who make you a little bit nervous.
Yeah.
There's two books that come to mind that I think are particularly relevant. One is Don Green's book called Fight Your Fear and Win. And it's written for a general audience. It's not written for athletes per se, but it comes with an assessment at the beginning of it, where you can kind of find out where your mental strengths and weaknesses lie, and it's based off of the one that he created specific for athletes. And if you answer it based on your golf game, or as a salesperson, or as it relates to public speaking or presenting to the board, you can take it in a variety of ways. Just think of one consistent thing, and it then leads to the rest of the book, which is a variety of anecdotes and case studies and stories, but also specific actionable exercises that you can use to strengthen your ability in these areas and see a difference in your life, but also on the golf course. So I like that it's structured in that sort of way, and it lets you target specific things instead of the mental sphere just being a complete mystery.
Yeah.
And there's another book, and I should say too that there are high-level athletes who have used this book. Folks who have been in the Olympics. Folks you've very possibly seen on TV who have used this book and these strategies and have gone on to benefit from them. So even though it's written for a general audience, it's still helpful for athletes. The other book is written by the sports psychologist for the St. Louis Cardinals. It's called 10-Minute Toughness by Jason Selk, S-E-L-K. And I like this book too because it's also highly programmatic. It's not just sort of a vague, these are all the things that are interesting and important, but here's what you do. It'll take 10 minutes a day and just do this and you'll find that your performance improves. And I like that sort of structure. I like that it's also short. It doesn't take more than 10 minutes a day, and that's something that most of us can find some time to do.
Well, Amazon.com is going to be happy with me again because I found 2 new things to get. Noah, this has really been a delight to talk with you, and I think golfers who are looking for some additional improvement strategies are really gonna enjoy what we got to talk about. Well, I'll put some links, and I hope I remember, I may even put the links to those books on the website. I'll put the link to Noah's Bulletproof Musician site, and again, don't let that scare you off. There's a lot of great things in there related to golfers who want to play their best. And there's even, it might even be worth reading the 8 practice hacks thing that you've got on there, your ebook. But you obviously enjoy what you get to do with your career now. That comes through. And so I really appreciate, again, that we've had this time to talk today. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
You bet. Bye now.
Taking your game to new heights. www.gameimprovementgolf.com.
Well, Noah, thanks again for that information-filled interview. And about 5 minutes after we completed the interview, I got on Amazon.com and bought the 2 books you talked about, Fight Your Fear and Win and 10-Minute Toughness. 2 terrific books. I read the first one already and actually have used it in some things where I was a little nervous. Some of the principles in it, and it helped me to be able to perform a little better. The links to these books are in the show notes, and in addition, the link to Noah's Bulletproof Musician website and his blog posts. He posts his blog every Sunday, and I look forward to opening my email every Sunday and reading his blog post. Every one is terrific. I'll also mention again that the Golf Science Lab Motor Learning Virtual Summit presentations go live on Monday, November 16th. I'm excited to be one of the presenters and also to learn from other, I believe, about 10 or so great presenters who will be part of this virtual summit. If you haven't checked out the link to that summit and might be interested, the link there is also in the show notes. Well, as somebody says each 2 weeks, that's it for today. In 2 weeks, I'm going to be doing, actually at the roundtable, some mini interviews with some of the participants and people who are presenters. And I will bring those together in my next podcast in 2 weeks and share some of the learning from the AGCP Roundtable with you. See you then.
Game Improvement Golf, your source of information and inspiration to become an exceptional golfer now. www.gameimprovementgolf.com